So Brandon Sanderson's newest Cosmere novel, The Isles of the Emberdark, has just released. And while I've started to see some people putting up spoiler-free reviews discussing it, I don't want to do that. I want to talk about this book, all of it. All of the Cosmere implications, all of the connections from a fully spoiler perspective. If you're someone who has not read the expanded works of the Cosmere, I'm talking every single fiction, because we're going to reference basically all of them over the course of this video, this might not be for you. But if you're someone like me who is fully caught up on the Cosmere, yeah, maybe stick around, because there are a lot of different connections and implications that take place over the course of this. Now, I'm not going to claim to be some sort of Cosmere scholar. There's definitely stuff that I have missed, but I do want to touch on some of the bigger ones for sure, and especially the implications for the Cosmere as we are really, truly getting into the space age. If you enjoy this kind of content, if you like the Cosmere or just sci-fi and fantasy book reviews in general, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button and let me know down in the comments. Are you guys starting to get some Cosmere fatigue? Kind of counterintuitive from the start of this video, but man, I'm starting to feel a little bit, because I have some mixed feelings about this book. The first one I think I have read yet in the Cosmere that truly kind of feels like filler, which is a tough thing to say if you're a fan of the Brandon Sanderson in this work. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about Isles of the Emberdark. Now, of course, this book follows two main POVs, which is definitely a bit of a change up from a lot of his previous works. We've either seen these sort of broad spanning works, things like, obviously the Stormlight Archive, which covers, I don't even know, dozens of POVs over the course of the series, or we've seen much more sort of focused in ones like A Tress of the Emerald Sea, as an example, which is obviously a bit of a weird example because he uses Hoy as a narrator, but you get the idea, sort of following one main POV. This one follows two. We've got Dusk and Starling. Dusk, of course, being a trapper from the First of the Sun. If you guys have read that novella, it's sort of interspersed throughout this, and actually I think a really creative way and sort of a fun way to introduce this. And then it sort of touches on Starling, who is the niece of Frost, who is a dragon that we've seen looming at the edge of the Cosmere in a bunch of different ways. Obviously a strong connection of Hoyd to Hoyd, and one of the few beings that we've encountered in the whole thing that actually predates the Shattering, was born before the fall of Adonalsian. So that's kind of a pretty big character here, and Starling sort of as this sort of intersection of Hoyd and Frost, I thought was a really interesting character, and the first time we've really gotten to get into a mind of a dragon, albeit a juvenile one, which I think sort of was a pretty smart way to approach this character. But I still wish that she'd felt a little bit more dragony, I'm not gonna lie. So this book has a loose plot. It is a loose plot. It's an adventure story. It definitely, I think, nods to some of the stuff that was done in Tress. It sort of takes to the high seas a little bit, of course, the seas in this case being the Emberdark, or as we would know it, Shadesmar, the cognitive realm, and sort of going off the beaten path of sort of where humans and their minds or other creatures in the Cosmere are sort of shaped. I'm going to call it the Emberdark, I think, for this video, or Shades. I'm going to use them both interchangeably. We'll see what the context is, and sort of goes off into the less known, what they would really call the Emberdark, the less known or less refined areas of Shadesmar, areas that are in space traditionally, or sort of space as we know it now. And I do love the fact that it was touched on over the course of this book, the idea that they're aware of how they are changing and actually lengthening Shadesmar because of their perception and knowledge of space, and how if they keep doing that and keep becoming more knowledgeable, it may be just as fast or slow, I should guess, to traverse through Shadesmar as it is through the physical realm, actually in space, even though they touch on having FTL travel, which dropped as a one-liner, but holy crap, we're gonna have to touch on that at some point. But like I said, this book has a bit more of an amorphous plot. It sort of follows Dusk on his journey and his track through, trying to save his planet, kind of. He's trying to find proof that there are people out there that can help them, and that there is a way to traverse Shadesmar. It's his journey was very fast and loose. I'm not gonna lie. It was just sort of this amorphous thing of like, I've got to prove that we can get help, and I've got to prove that we can do this. And Vathi's just sort of stalling for him on the planet, because their planet, the First of the Sun, has been obviously, if you've read the novel up to this point, you sort of have this sense, but it has been discovered by both the Scadrians and the Rasharans. So it is sort of, it's at this apex of these two very, very powerful factions, and again, setting up sort of the potential three-way war that we may eventually see between Retribution, Discord, and Autonomy. Autonomy is not really referenced or mentioned at all in this book, but I do know that they're sort of lurking in the shadows. But of course, this very strong strategic position that First of the Sun has, and obviously its potential to have a perpendicularity to go from Shadesmar to the physical realm is a huge deal. And knowing that they have access to that has massive implications, and I'll touch on that from a Rashard perspective over this video. But again, it sort of follows these two very simple plots. Can we get help and survive? And for Starling, just like, can I help my crew? Can I save my crew? This book is interesting. It has very low stakes and very big implications. And that's a very odd combination to have. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit now. In terms of the stakes, there was never really a point in this book where I was ever worried about any of the characters, like actually being in any real danger. I was, despite the fact that we have like a pretty large sized crew, I was never actually worried that any of them were going to die, because sort of right off the bat, the tone of this book was much more akin to something like A Tress of the Emerald Sea. It felt much more like a fairy tale adventure, but brought down and grounded a bit, and grounded in the head of these two characters. And while I think Starling definitely had some of the whimsy, that Tress had, it definitely didn't nearly approach that same level. And obviously not having Hoyt as a narrator and having a much more sort of grounded third-person POV, I don't know if it helped or hurted, honestly. And I sort of touched on at the start of this video. This book just felt like setup in a lot of ways. Like, am I the only one who felt like this? It's sort of interesting. I mean, I think part of it may be coming down to the fact that, and as much as I hate to say this, I kind of feel like I'm outgrowing Sanderson's writing a little bit. This is the first book that I read where I actually felt like the prose was holding the book back a little bit. It was very streamlined, very efficient. It was a fast read. I generally enjoyed this book. Again, I read it in like a day and a half, but I wasn't drawn into it. It felt a little bit hollow, if that makes any sense. I'm really curious if you're watching this, if you've read the book and you kind of feel the same way. I never really felt like I had these super deep connections to the characters, despite the fact that we spent a lot of time with Dust, a lot of time with Starling. You know, they do have some sort of sense of arc over the course of the book, though I think they were a little bit ham-fisted. I think part of the problem is that I've read some really good books this year. I mean, even just the last couple that I've read, between like The Devils and The Will of the Many, and Empire of Silence, I've read like R.F. Kuang and Tchaikovsky and Glenn Cook and John Bierce. Like, I've read a lot of really good technical writers in the past year, even the past 6 months. And I think part of it, for the first time, I'm really starting to see the criticism that people are levying at Sanderson's prose. This book did kind of feel a little bit skin deep. And there were a lot of sort of messages that were tried to brought to you, the whole idea of, you know, holding on to the past while still embracing the future, and the whole idea that, you know, we have to rely on other people, and that when sometimes you give up control and you let other people shine. Like, there were two very kind of clear arcs that manifested over the course of this book. But the problem was this book felt like the entire thing was just so ham-fisted. Like, what are the chances? I mean, in a world where Hoyt exists and is constantly trying to like manage and steer things, I mean, how can you even answer this question? Like, Paul, it happens, so the book could happen. But like, the idea that all of these things happened at the same time is kind of odd. And I guess, again, in a world with shards and gods and larger overarching powers, which clearly do have a tangible impact in the book, I guess you can kind of overlook that, because that's just the world of the Cosmere. You know what I mean? Grand coincidences are going to happen. But I wish there had maybe been, the sense of time in this book had been maybe a little bit looser. Like, they didn't happen to need that he rolls up to the island the exact same moment the ship is arriving, and so the rest of the plot can happen, as it were. Again, I like these characters generally. There were definitely themes of things like colonialism, which were sort of touched on, and they literally outright calling the Maoist fascists, which I thought was fun and interesting, because it's like, does that truly mean that, you know, harmony has descended into discord at this point? So yeah, I think there were a lot of really interesting implications explored in this book, and none of them were touched on enough. There was so much sort of light plot that happened that I think it sort of overwhelmed Sanderson trying to dive that next level deeper. And it almost didn't feel like he was respecting us as enough as a reader to sort of go into it a bit more. Or he was just afraid he was both ham-fisted and not heavy enough. It was a very interesting combination. Again, this book just felt like, again, low stakes and high implications. There are so many Cosmere connections throughout this, talking about Silverlight and the history of the dragons and confirmations that humans originated on Yolen, and the long-term implications of the connections with dragons, and that the idea that, again, we know that humans predate Adonalsian. So like, but we also talk about shards creating people, and so they're taking the sort of template that exists somewhere else. Obviously talking about arcanists and the connections, you know, obviously even little things like having Crow make an appearance in this, and that connection to Tress. So all of this is sort of happening around the same time, but also referencing other characters who we've seen like hundreds or thousands of years earlier, and the whole idea that time happens differently. They even talked about the time dilation, like one day within Silverlight is 10 days on the outside. So how Sanderson is going to be able to build in stuff to keep characters alive long term that he needs to, and the whole idea of the sort of idea of this time dilation. So It's like, wow, there were just so many things. The idea of invention and the grand apparatus, so similar to something like a Yumi, coming into play there, and sort of how that all fits. The idea that the sleepless, we sort of got a number on how many there were. There are actually not very many of them, which is kind of confirmed, but that they're potentially more like outright evil in some places than others, but maybe not. Maybe it's misunderstood. But again, so many things were sort of touched on and teased, but nothing's actually explored. Nothing's actually explained. Nothing's actually resolved. And again, the whole idea that the setup of this book is to set up the idea that as humanity is moving forward, or all these different parties, they are going to be able to navigate the Emberdark. They're going to be able to properly navigate Shadesmar. That's really what this book set us up to do. And obviously introduce this crew that's going to be levied somewhere else. Now, I think part of the problem is that when this crew was introduced, it happened all at once. And other than Starling, I don't really care about these characters. I didn't really get to know them enough, I feel. And I think that was the one downside of this dual POV, is we didn't really get to spend a lot of time. I guess enough, but I don't know. I mean, we had this nice moment with the engineer sort of at the start of the book, and I thought, okay, that's a really great moment. It really tells you a lot about who Starling is as a character. It sort of integrates that, but we never really had those moments with anyone else, like Ed the Arcanist. One at the Arcanist. We didn't really get anything about him other than he wore a silly hat and he's got a lot of knowledge. You know what I mean? Like, Lenora, the pilot, we don't really get to learn anything about her other than the fact that, she's escaped and doesn't really go with, what the Scadrians are trying to do. And that's kind of it. Obviously, we have now the connections of the specters coming in and all this kind of stuff, and the idea that, that they're more common out in the Cosmere, to the point now where the Scadrians have enough, and I'm going to pronounce that, Scadrian? I don't know. Confirm how to pronounce that in the comments. And the idea that they've now encountered the Shades so much from Threnody that they have ways to properly imprison them, that they have ways to disrupt Sleepless. Like, technology is becoming to a point where it is becoming sort of a catch-all, and the idea that they have sort of these multi-tools that can plug into anything and utilize anything. And it kind of felt clumsy. I'm even realizing I'm saying it now. This sort of thrust into the space age that we got a little bit in Sunlit Man, that we got a little bit in Tress, but in a much more contained way, I think felt a little bit clumsy. And I think part of the reason why it felt that way is because it didn't happen in space. They keep talking about spaceships, but we were never in space. We were never in the physical realm anytime that it mattered. So they could jump out of a ship. They could do all this other kind of, they never needed to deal with a vacuum. So you have sort of like, part of what makes a great hard sci-fi book or a space opera compelling is the real needs of dealing with the threat of something like space. And yes, they did need to deal with that a little bit, the coating of the ship and not wanting to fall through the Emberdark and all this kind of stuff. It never really, I think, impacted the same way that like opening a door or taking off your helmet, or it's like, space is a threat constantly in a space opera. I mean, you read something like the Expanse as an example, and that's constantly something you have to think and worry about. And it's like Sanderson just didn't want to do that. He wanted all the benefits of being in a space age in terms of technology and guns, and we'll talk on guns later. But he didn't want to do the heavy lifting from like a practical perspective. I'm not saying it cheapened the book, but it definitely, I don't know. I didn't love it quite so much. So yeah, this book, again, I think it just tried to accomplish a little bit too much. It tried to be this sort of cute, fun, endearing story, sort of after Tress. It tried to have a lot of those fun little nods and connections. But at the same time, it really tried to lean into those connections. Again, it tried to harken back to a half dozen different characters, every single different kind of magic system. We talked about steel fields. We talked about Aether. We talked about, literal examples of shard bearers flying on another planet. I mean, we had all these different things, all these different connections. And I feel like we've gotten to the point now where we're hitting some Cosmere fatigue, because while Tress was this beautiful, fun, cute story written with so much love for his wife, this book didn't have that heart. And at the same time now, I feel for anybody trying to read this, there is now so much to keep track. You have to sit next to you with a thesaurus or 17 Shard of the Coppermind just sitting up in front of you. But at the same time, I am someone who is pretty well versed in what is going on. And even I felt like, man, I feel like I'm missing some stuff, or I absolutely would not be appreciating this unless I had, a really, really strong endemic knowledge of this, unless I was on the subreddits, unless I was, keeping track of the different, fan theories and posts that people were putting out about this. But I have some of my own. despite all this, despite some of my misgivings about this book, despite my enjoying it but wishing it had gone a little bit deeper, just again, despite feeling like this book was sort of just, I don't want to say phoned in. I don't want to say phoned in because it's not. But feeling like this was simply just a setup book. This was a setup book. It was setting up the need for navigators. It was setting up Starling and her crew, and it was setting up the war between Roshar and Skadra, like this, the war between Retribution and Discord. And yeah, this book just kind of felt, again, it really didn't have any stakes. It just sort of felt like he needed to set up a bunch of stuff for us for future books in the Cosmere to make sense. And rather than sort of lightly introducing them through these sort of more streamlined stories, he wanted to just sort of give us, again, a very sort of rehash, sort of ship voyagey book and bring the crew together and all that fun stuff. Again, fun adventure stories. Very sort of, I mean, I kind of go back to Le Guin a little bit with Earthsea, kind of channeling some of those vibes. But again, I'm unfortunately just without the heart that I think goes into a story like that. And a heart we know Sanderson can produce, which is why it's such a shame. So yeah, those are my very mixed opinions. An enjoyable book, a fun little read, great little connections, but just kind of a hollow book. A book that I guess needed to exist, I guess was fun to exist, and I'm not angry that I read it. But a book that just, I think, in a world where we have so many really great hard-hitting Cosmere books that make me laugh and make me cry, this book didn't really make me do either. I just kind of read it. I enjoyed the characters, they were fine, but they didn't really compel me. And again, I didn't really feel like the stakes were ever super, super high. We didn't really have a great villain. The villain was more just sort of the time and the space. And again, this just kind of felt like filler. So let me know down below in the comments, guys. Am I way off? Am I feeling a little bit jaded? Am I finally starting? Is it a me problem? And it very well might be. It very well might be. This might just me sort of starting to grow past Sanderson's writing a little bit. But are we just starting to run into Cosmere fatigue? Is his prolific writing skill finally starting to kick him in the butt a little bit? Let me know in the comments. Let me know. And again, if you enjoy this kind of video, if you want to see more of these kind of in-depth reviews on books, both from the Cosmere and without, let me know. And I'll be sure to get to those. We have more Red Rising coming up, continuing with that series. More in the Sun Eater series is coming out as well. So I really have been enjoying those. I'm really going to continue to dive into those too, as well as some other fun stuff, things like Jade City. I've got sitting on my bedside table right now. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers.